I'll start with what everybody already knows, because if I don't, someone will say I'm hiding something. The Vorakin Grand Arena was not a place you went to survive. You need to understand that before anything else. People sometimes describe it as entertainment. They call it sport. They use words like competition and spectacle and tradition. And technically, sure, technically those words apply, the same way you can technically describe a drowning as swimming. The arena sat at the center of Vorak Station, a deep space installation the size of a small moon, owned and operated by the Vorakin Merchant Consortium, which was a fancy name for the oldest crime syndicate in the Western Spiral Arm. The station had been out here for 600 years. The arena had been running for 580 of them. In that time, it had hosted over 40,000 recorded events. Fighters from 37 species had entered the sand. The win records varied by species. Some did better than others. The Dravathi almost always won. The Kethkar, with their 4 arms and layered bone plating, had a respectable survival rate. Even some of the Uraki, bug-eyed and slow on their feet but devastatingly strong, managed to walk out more often than not. Humans had been fighting in the arena for about 60 years. Not many of them, but enough. Enough that the crowd had an opinion. Most species brought in fighters who volunteered, criminals who were given a choice, prisoners of war bartered through alliance deals. Humans arrived the same way, mostly. And humans, statistically speaking, died at a higher rate than almost any other species in the arena. Not because they were weak. The Vorakin bookmakers had learned that lesson about 40 years ago when a human named Marcus Wen fought a Dravathi blade champion for 11 minutes and then walked off the sand with a dislocated shoulder and the championship belt. No, humans didn't die because they were weak. They died because the Vorakin event managers kept putting them in situations designed to kill them. That's the part the propaganda reels never talked about. The events were supposed to be fair. Matched opponents, weight classes, skill assessments, all of it. And for most fighters, most of the time, that's how it worked. But the consortium also had another practice. A quieter one. They called it scenic scheduling. The fighters called it something else. Most of the terms translate roughly to being murdered with extra steps. Scenic scheduling meant that when the consortium needed someone dead, someone inconvenient, someone who'd seen too much, someone whose death had been commissioned by a paying client, they put that person in the arena under conditions that made survival mathematically impossible. 3 opponents instead of 1. Weapons on the opponent's side only. Environmental hazards on a timer. The crowd never knew. It just looked like a bad day for whoever was on the sand. His name was Dax Morrow. I'm going to say that before I go any further, because the records sometimes just call him the Human Subject, or Gladiator 7, or Arena Unit M7, and every time I see that I feel something clench up in my chest. His name was Dax Morrow. He was from a city on Earth called Porto Alegre, and before the war that took him off-planet, he'd been studying to be an engineer. He was 29 years old. He'd been in the arena for 14 months. He had 17 wins, no losses, and scars on his left side that he said came from his 3rd fight against a Kethkar sub-champion, who'd gotten one clean swipe before going down. He was the best fighter the arena had seen in a decade, according to Warden Dorvath Khan, and the consortium had decided he needed to die. I'll let the warden take it from here, because he was closer to it than I was. From the recorded testimony of Dorvath Khan, Arena Warden, Vorak Station, given before the Galactic Tribunal, Standard Year 2891.7. You want me to tell you what I saw? All right, I'll tell you what I saw. I've been warden here for 19 years. In 19 years, I've processed somewhere close to 3,000 fighters through this facility. I've watched good ones go into the sand and not come back. I've watched fighters I expected nothing from walk out with the crowd screaming their name. You get a feel for people in this job. You develop instincts. When they brought the human in, Dax Morrow, my instinct said, this one's different. Not different the way people mean when they say a fighter is talented. I mean different in some way I didn't have a word for. He looked at the arena the way engineers look at a building they're about to design. Like he was calculating something. Like he was already figuring out how things would go. He was quiet. Most fighters come in loud. The ones who have survived multiple bouts especially, they've got this front they put on, this performance of confidence. Morrow didn't do that. He ate his meals quietly. He asked questions about the arena's floor composition, the weight of the standard issue weapons, the lighting rigs. One time he asked me how the drainage worked. I told him and he just nodded like he was filing it away. He won 17 fights in 14 months. Some of them against opponents who should have killed him on paper. The Kethkar sub-champion, a Dravathi pair who were supposed to fight together as a unit, a machine-augmented Uraki who'd been modified with subdermal blade rigs. He beat all of them. Some of it was skill. Some of it was that calculating thing he did. He never seemed to be reacting. He seemed like he was always 3 moves ahead of where everyone else was. The consortium noticed. When you win that many times, the betting margins start to compress. The bookmakers don't like that. The consortium really doesn't like that. And so, about 3 weeks before the events I'm here to testify about, I received a scheduling notification for what they called a scenic event. I'd seen those before. I knew what they meant. The notification said that Morrow would be fighting in a triple match event. 3 opponents sequential. No rest period between bouts. Weapons restricted to standard grade only, meaning Morrow wouldn't have access to the enhanced gear he'd been using. His opponents would be a Dravathi blade pair fighting as a unit, one Kethkar heavy who'd been chemically stimulated, which is not legal, but the consortium does it anyway, and a modified combat drone set to lethal mode. Even I knew he wasn't supposed to walk out of that. And then 2 days before the scheduled event, everything changed. I need to stop here and tell you about the princess. Her name was Thessaly von Morik. She was the 3rd daughter of Emperor von Morik of the Vorathan Imperium, which is one of the oldest and most politically significant civilizations in the galactic core. The Vorathan weren't members of the Galactic Consortium. They had their own governance, their own legal frameworks, their own military. They'd been approached for membership in the consortium 17 times over the past century and refused each time, politely but firmly. Thessaly was 23 standard years old. She had the characteristic Vorathan physical features, iridescent skin that shifted between deep violet and pale silver depending on the light, eyes that were solid black with faint luminescent rings around the iris, and the elongated finger joints that Vorathan used for long-range tactile communication. She was small, not fragile small, just compact. Her people were built lean and precise, not broad. She was also, by her own people's standards, considered something of a problem. Not because she was cruel or unstable, because she was too interested in things. She asked questions about species outside the Imperium. She'd learned 7 languages that the Vorathan noble class considered beneath their station, including 2 forms of human dialect. She'd read histories of wars the Imperium considered settled and come back with inconvenient conclusions. She'd publicly stated, at a High Council dinner, that the Vorathan policy of non-engagement with Outer Rim civilizations was strategically short-sighted and morally cowardly. That last one had gotten her sent away. Not exiled officially. Officially, she was on a diplomatic observation tour of the outer spiral arm, accompanied by a small retinue and orders to observe galactic customs, report back, and most importantly, stay out of things. What nobody told her and what she found out later was that the tour was also a removal. Her presence in the core was inconvenient. Her father's advisors had decided that a few years on the Outer Rim, away from the levers of power, would quiet her down. And if something happened to her out here in the rough and unregulated territory of deep space, well, accidents happened. The Outer Rim was dangerous. These things were unfortunate. She arrived at Vorex Station as a passenger on a mid-class transport. Her retinue had been reduced to 3 attendants before she left. Her main security escort had been reassigned at the last minute, a decision made by advisors she trusted, for reasons that made sense on the surface. She arrived, in other words, mostly alone. And she did what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. She went looking. She found the arena. From the personal written record of Dax Morrow, recovered from Cell Block 7, Vorex Station, authenticated by handwriting analysis. Entry, approximate date 3 days before scenic event. New visitor at the observation rail today. Not the usual crowd. They get these high-tier watchers sometimes, consortium clients, nobles from core worlds, people who paid for a premium view. Most of them look at the fighters the way people look at animals in a zoo. This one was different. She watched differently. She wasn't watching the fight. She was watching me watch the fight. I was in the prep corridor waiting for my slot on the practice sand, and she was up at the rail above, and I looked up and she was already looking down, not at the current fighters, at me. She had these eyes, pure black, rings of light around the center, I've seen a few Vorathan on the station. Rare out here. She was younger than most I've seen. She watched me for maybe 20 seconds, and then she did something unexpected. She nodded, not like a greeting, like she was confirming something to herself. Like she'd already decided something, and was just checking to make sure she had the right person. I don't know what to make of that. I'm probably reading too much into it. I haven't slept well in 3 weeks. Tomorrow's practice session is going to be hard. I need to be sharp. I've been thinking about the drainage system. Part 2, what she knew that nobody told her. Thessaly von Morik had been on Vorak station for 6 hours when she figured out what the arena actually was. This is not an exaggeration, 6 hours. She'd spent 4 of those hours walking the station, the market levels, the transit corridors, the hospitality rings where wealthy clients stayed in rooms with views of the stars and catered meals brought by service drones. She'd talked to people. She was good at that, better than the Vorathan nobility was supposed to be. She asked questions that sounded casual. She listened to answers that people hadn't meant to give her. By hour 4, she knew the consortium ran the station as a money generation mechanism built around controlled violence. By hour 5, she knew about scenic scheduling, or at least enough about it to understand the concept, if not the name. By hour 6, she'd gone to the arena's public access observation level and started watching. She wasn't there for entertainment. She was there because she was building a picture of how the place worked, and the arena was the center of it. She saw Dax Morrow in the prep corridor and understood immediately that he was different from the other fighters. The way he moved. The way he looked at the space around him. She'd grown up watching her father's military commanders, and they had a particular quality, a way of processing an environment that wasn't reactive but predictive. Morrow had that quality. It was unmistakable to her, even from 30 meters above. She made some inquiries that afternoon. Subtle ones, filtered through her attendants who filtered through neutral third parties. She found out who he was, what his record was, what was scheduled for him in 2 days. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, because she was thinking, and when she was thinking, sleep was impossible. She went back to the arena at 5th bell, when the observation levels were mostly empty, and she stood at the rail and looked down at the practice sand where Morrow was running solo drills in the pre-dawn light cycles, moving through weapon forms in the half-dark, not knowing she was watching. She watched for 2 hours, and then she went to speak to the arena warden. From the recorded testimony of Dorvath Khan, continued. She walked into my office at 7th bell, unannounced, and sat down across from my desk without being invited to. Just sat, like it was completely natural. I knew who she was by then. Word travels fast on the station when someone like her arrives. Vorathan royalty, third in line on some kind of observation tour. I was polite. I asked how I could assist her. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You have a human fighter scheduled for a triple scenic event in 48 hours. I want to know who commissioned it." I'll be honest with you, I almost fell out of my chair. Nobody talked about scenic events like that. Not out loud, not in an office, not to someone they'd just met. The information was technically internal, though anyone paying attention could figure it out. But naming it the way she named it, directly, flatly, like it was just a fact she needed confirmed, that wasn't how things worked here. I told her I didn't know what she was referring to. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that told me she'd expected me to say that. Then she put a data chip on my desk. She said, "On that chip is documentation of 11 scenic events run over the past 4 years, including 2 involving nobles from core member species, which is a violation of the Galactic Commerce Treaty, Article 44, Section 9. I obtained it from public shipping logs, financial transfer records, and 2 conversations with people who had too much to drink last night." She paused. "I would like to know who commissioned the humans event. I'm going to find out regardless. I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me directly." I looked at the chip for a long time. Then I told her. The commissioner was a Vorakan merchant lord named Orath Dren. He ran the 3rd largest trading house in the outer spiral arm and had a financial interest in several fighters who Morrow had made unprofitable. He'd paid the consortium 200,000 consortium credits to arrange the event. The payment had been routed through 4 shell companies and arrived looking like a legitimate sponsorship deal. Thessaly took this information, thanked the warden, and left. Then she went directly to Morrow's cell block. From the personal written record of Dax Morrow. Entry 2 days before scenic event. She came to my cell this morning, the one from the observation rail, the Vorathan. I don't know how she got past the guard checkpoint. When I asked, she said she'd explained the situation to the guard and he'd understood. I didn't ask what that meant. She told me what was scheduled for me in 2 days. She said it in a completely calm voice, like she was reading a maintenance report. Triple event, no rest. Enhanced opponents. Modified drone. She said my odds of survival based on variables she'd calculated were approximately 4%. I told her I'd already figured that out. She seemed surprised, not upset surprised, interested surprised. She asked how. I told her about the scheduling changes I'd noticed, the way the timing had shifted, the quality of the briefing material, the fact that my normal pre-event equipment assessment had been quietly canceled. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What were you planning to do?" I told her I was still working on it, that I'd been thinking about the drainage system. She looked at me for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor of my cell, just sat down cross-legged on the floor and said, "Tell me about the drainage system." I don't know why, but I did. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, she had 17 follow-up questions, and I had the beginning of something that might actually work. She left when the first shift alarms went off. Before she went, she said, "I'll be at the observation rail tomorrow at dawn. I have some things to arrange." I asked what kind of things. She said consequences. I didn't ask what that meant either. Part 3, the morning before the sand. The day before a scheduled scenic event at the Vorakin Grand Arena was supposed to be routine. Waivers processed, opponents briefed, betting lines finalized, crowd notifications sent. Everything tidy and moving on rails. The day before Dax Morrow's scheduled triple event was not routine. It started at second bell, when an anonymous data packet arrived at the offices of the Galactic Commercial Oversight Division, the governing body responsible for monitoring trade and treaty compliance across 32 star systems. The packet contained documentation of 11 scenic events, including 2 involving citizens of core member species, along with a financial trace linking the events to specific consortium principles. By fourth bell, the Oversight Division had forwarded the packet to the Galactic Tribunal's investigative arm. By sixth bell, the tribunal had issued a preliminary inquiry notification to the Vorakin Merchant Consortium. By seventh bell, 3 separate legal teams representing core member species whose citizens had been victims of scenic events had been contacted by parties unknown and were preparing civil proceedings. The consortium's senior management was, to use the mildest possible translation of the Vorakin term, having a catastrophic morning. None of them initially connected this to the Vorathan noble who'd arrived the previous day. She'd been so quiet about it, so polite, so seemingly just a curious tourist asking a few casual questions. Orath Dren, the merchant lord who'd commissioned Morrow's event, found out about the tribunal inquiry while he was eating breakfast. He spent the next 2 hours making panicked calls to consortium contacts and legal representatives. His attempts to quietly cancel the commissioned event were complicated by the fact that cancellation required a formal request through official channels, which would create a paper trail connecting him to the commission in the first place. He was, in the language of Morrow's planet, stuck. By ninth bell, there were consortium security personnel posted at every entrance to the arena's event management wing, trying to figure out where the data leak had come from. By 10th bell, Thessaly von Morik had walked up to the practice sand railing, coffee-equivalent drink in hand from one of the station's hospitality vendors, and was watching Dax Morrow run his morning drills. She looked, Selix of House Muron told me later, entirely at peace. From the recorded testimony of Selixa of House Muron, crowd-level witness, filed with the Galactic Tribunal. I was at the arena that morning because I had a client meeting in the hospitality ring attached to the arena's west face, and I arrived early and decided to watch the practice session while I waited. I was standing near the observation rail when the Vorathan arrived. I noticed her immediately. Her species was unusual in this part of the station, and she had that quality some people have where you just notice them when they enter a space. She stood at the rail and watched the fighter below with this completely focused expression. Not cold, just focused. The fighter, the human, looked up at some point and saw her. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. She raised her drink toward him. Then they both went back to what they were doing. It was strange, like they knew each other, like whatever conversation they'd had was still going on in some way, just without words. About 20 minutes later, 3 men arrived at the rail. Not watchers, they didn't have the look of people there for the practice session. 2 of them I recognized as consortium security, though they weren't in uniform. The third I didn't know, older Vorakin, wearing the kind of clothing that said money but not taste. That was Orath Dren, I found out later. He walked up to the Vorathan and said something. I was close enough to hear, but he spoke quietly, something about her presence being noted and appreciated, and whether she might be interested in a private conversation about certain matters. She didn't look at him, she kept watching the fighter below. She said, in a perfectly polite voice, "If you're here to discuss the event scheduled for tomorrow, I should tell you that my legal team has already filed the preliminary documentation with the tribunal. Whatever you say to me now will be included in the record." She paused and took a sip of her drink. "If you're here to threaten me, I should tell you that I am a registered diplomatic representative of the Vorathan Imperium, which means any threat made against my person is a declaration of hostile intent against the Imperium, and the Imperium has 14 warships currently within 2 days' travel of this station on routine patrol. Routine, but nearby." Dren stared at her. She finally turned to look at him. She smiled, and I'll tell you it was not a warm smile, not cruel either, just precise, like a blade that knew exactly what it was for. She said, "Was there anything else?" He left, his security left with him. He walked very quickly. The Vorathan turned back to the rail and watched the human finish his drill set. I think I stood there for about 5 minutes, just processing what I'd witnessed. Then I went and rescheduled my client meeting, because I was not leaving that arena. Part 4, the day of the sand. The event was not cancelled. This surprised people afterward. Given the legal pressure, the tribunal inquiry, the threat of Imperium intervention, many expected the consortium to simply pull the event from the schedule. The practical approach, quiet and face-saving. But the consortium had a problem. The event had been publicly listed for 8 days. There was a crowd coming, 4,000 paid entries. The betting markets had been running for 5 days. Canceling meant refunds, meant market corrections, meant questions. The consortium was already in a fragile position with the tribunal inquiry. Canceling a major scheduled event at the last minute would look like an admission of something. And Dren, panicking, had spent the previous 18 hours trying to modify rather than cancel. He couldn't reach a clean resolution. His legal team had advised him that the cleanest outcome was for the event to run, for the human to lose in the normal course of events. Tragic, yes, but these things happened. And for the financial connections to remain murky enough that the tribunal couldn't build a clean case. So the event ran. And Thessaly von Morik, who had somehow obtained a front-row hospitality suite through means the consortium couldn't immediately trace, was there for all of it. She sat in the suite with 2 of her attendants. She had a viewing screen, a communications terminal, and a direct link to the Galactic Tribunal observer who had traveled to the station overnight following her data submission. The observer sat 3 seats away from her, with a recording unit running. The crowd was loud. 4,000 people from 20-something species, packed into tiered seats that rose from the arena floor like a geological formation. The noise was physical. You felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The sand below was pale gold. The arena floor was 120 meters across, roughly oval, with embedded lighting rigs that could shift the color of the light at the event manager's discretion. There were obstacles, low walls, pillars, elevated platforms that could rise or descend from the floor on hydraulic systems. Sometimes they were deployed for tactical variety. Sometimes they were deployed to give one fighter an advantage they needed over another. Dax Mora walked out first. He came from the east gate alone. No announcement, no fanfare, those came after for the crowd. He just walked out onto the sand and stood for a moment and looked at the arena the way he always looked at everything, like he was reading it. He was carrying a standard-grade short blade and a standard-grade shield. Nothing enhanced. The event managers had made sure of that. He was wearing the arena's basic combat armor, light chest protection, leg guards, nothing on the arms beyond bracers. It was the minimum permitted by event rules. He looked small on that sand. That's what Celixa told me. Even though she knew what she knew, even though she'd watched him fight before, standing alone in that enormous space with the crowd noise coming down on him from every direction, he looked small. Then he put his blade in the sand, point down. He put his hand on the grip and he just stood there, not moving, not performing for the crowd, just standing like he was part of the arena and had been there the whole time. From the personal written record of Dax Morrow, recovery note, this entry was written approximately 8 hours after the events described and was found alongside the cell block entries. I want to get this down while I can still remember it clearly, because I know the way memory works, and I know that in a week some of these details will have softened or shifted. When I walked onto the sand, the first thing I noticed was the light. They'd set it slightly blue, not natural, not the standard warm gold they usually run. Blue light does something to your perception of depth and distance. It slightly compresses the sense of how far things are. I'd asked the warden about the lighting protocols 3 weeks ago and filed that away. I noticed the obstacles were configured asymmetrically. 3 low walls on the west side, 2 elevated platforms on the east. Standard configuration for enhanced opponents is symmetric, equal access for all participants. Asymmetric meant they expected me to be driven toward the west, where the walls would complicate my movement. I took note of all of this in the first 30 seconds. Then I waited. The first opponents came from the north gate. 2 Dravathi fighting as a pair. Dravathi were built for this. 6-limbed, 4 for movement, 2 upper limbs that served as arms and weapon holders simultaneously. They were fast. Not explosively fast in short bursts the way some species were, but fast in a sustained, flowing way, like water finding paths through rock. They communicated in combat through a series of clicks and pressure signals that were too fast for most species to intercept, which meant the pair fought with a coordination that looked almost psychic. They had long-form blade weapons, curved, with weighted tips and body armor that covered their vulnerable joint points without slowing them significantly. The crowd made a particular sound when they entered, a kind of satisfied murmur, like, yes, this is what we're here for. Morrow pulled his blade from the sand. He turned slightly to the left, shifting his center of gravity. The Dravathi pair spread immediately, one moving east, one moving west, trying to establish flanking positions. Classic pair combat opening. Take a third of the arena each, and force the single opponent into the center where they can be attacked from multiple angles. Morrow moved west. Not retreating, moving. He went toward the low walls, toward the side they expected to drive him to. Just went there voluntarily immediately before the flanking was complete. The western Dravathi hadn't reached position yet. Morrow got there first, and he used the first wall, dropped into a low crouch behind it with just his eyes above the edge and waited. The crowd went strange, confused. This wasn't how the fight was supposed to look. The western Dravathi closed in. It had to come around the wall to reach him. It couldn't attack effectively from a direct angle with the wall between them, and its partner was still repositioning from the east side. Morrow came out from behind the wall at a dead run, not toward the Dravathi, but at an angle, cutting across its path, making the Dravathi's weapon arm reach across its own body line to follow him, which the Dravathi did because the training said never let a prey species out of your sight, never let them get behind. And Morrow, already past the arm line, went low and put his blade into the joint gap below the left upper limb, where the armor didn't cover, and there was a major circulatory channel, and he was already moving past before the Dravathi started to fall. 7 seconds. 1 Dravathi down. The crowd was silent for a full breath. Then it erupted. From the recorded testimony of Celixa of House Muron, continued. I've watched arena fights my whole life. My family had a hospitality box since before I was born. I know what it looks like when someone wins a fight, and I know what it looks like when someone does something that makes even experienced crowd members go quiet. The crowd went quiet. Not because it was over, it wasn't over. There was still the other Dravathi, and the heavy and the drone. But because what the human had just done was, I don't have the right word in galactic standard. The closest term in my native language translates roughly as the moment when you understand you've been watching the wrong thing. We'd thought we were watching a man about to die. We were actually watching someone who had already decided how the fight was going to end and was working his way through it. The second Dravathi attacked immediately. Aggressive and direct grief response mixed with combat training, which makes fighters dangerous but predictable. It came at him hard. He didn't run. He stepped to the side just slightly, just enough, and the Dravathi's strike hit air, and he put his shoulder into its forward momentum and added to it, and the Dravathi ran itself into the elevated platform on the east side. He helped it get there. That's the only way I can describe it. He helped the Dravathi run into the platform by just slightly redirecting where it was already going. It hit the platform hard. Went down. The crowd was doing something I don't have a word for. Not cheering, not quiet. Something between the two, like the crowd itself wasn't sure what sound was appropriate. Then the north gate opened again. The Kethkar Heavy came out. Part 5, What Doesn't Break You. The Kethkar Heavy weighed approximately 400 kilograms. It was 2 meters and 40 centimeters of layered bone plating over dense muscle, with 2 secondary arms built for close quarters grappling and 2 primary arms that carried weapons it didn't particularly need because the bone plating and the weight alone were enough to end most fights. It had been chemically stimulated. Moro had no way to know that from looking at it, but it moved wrong too fast for something that size, and with a particular restless aggression that stimulated fighters showed. It didn't enter the arena the way combat-trained Kethkar usually did, assessing, positioning. It entered already moving toward him. Moro looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the floor. The Kethkar's mass moved in predictable ways under one condition. When it was moving fast, its momentum was enormous, and its ability to change direction was limited. At full charge, a Kethkar Heavy could not turn more than 40 degrees in a single stride without risking its own structural joints. Moro started running. Not away. He ran at an angle, crossing the Kethkar's path, and the Kethkar adjusted, good reflex. The stimulant was doing what it was supposed to, but Moro changed angle again, and the Kethkar adjusted again. And by the third change of angle, the Kethkar's momentum was a problem of its own making. And then Moro changed direction a 4th time and went entirely perpendicular to the creature's current path. And the drainage grate in the arena floor did exactly what Moro had expected. The arena floor had a system of subsurface drainage channels that processed biological matter and water from combat events. The channels ran in a grid, and the floor over them was slightly less structurally supported than the solid floor. Moro had asked about the drainage 3 weeks ago. He'd been asking about it the way an engineer asks about load-bearing walls. The Kethkar Heavy, moving at full speed and unable to redirect, ran across a drainage section at a mass and velocity combination the floor had not been designed for. The floor section buckled, and the Kethkar's front 2 limbs went through it up to the midpoint, bringing 400 kilograms to a sudden, catastrophic stop. It wasn't dead, it wasn't even badly hurt, but it was thoroughly stuck, and it was going to be stuck for a while, and Moro was already walking away. The crowd was doing something entirely new now, something that made the arena technicians look up from their consoles and glance at each other. It was cheering for a human. Up in the hospitality suite, Thessaly von Morik's expression had not changed significantly throughout any of this. She was watching. Her attendants were watching. The Galactic Tribunal Observer was watching, and his recording unit was getting all of it. What none of the consortium event managers could see from their positions was that Thessaly's communication terminal had been active since the fight began. She was on a live connection to the tribunal legal team. She was narrating, quietly, steadily, the specific violations she was observing in real time. The chemically stimulated opponent. The asymmetric obstacle configuration designed to disadvantage the human. The modified combat drone that was now being staged in the south staging corridor, whose specifications she'd obtained that morning from a maintenance contractor who'd been persuaded to share them by means that were technically legal but creatively applied. She wasn't just watching. She was building a case in real time while the fight happened below. The tribunal observer looked at her at some point and said something that Selixa reported overhearing from the adjacent suite. He said, "You planned this, all of it. The documentation, the timing, the observer placement, the contractor, you set this entire thing up before you ever spoke to the warden. She didn't look away from the arena. She said, I set the table. He's doing the hard part. The drone was the last opponent. Modified combat drones at the Vorakin arena were technically illegal under Galactic Commerce Treaty provisions. They'd been running them anyway for 6 years, through a classification loophole that called them autonomous training units operating in elevated parameters. The modification on this one specifically was a targeting system upgrade that allowed it to compensate for the smoke and light adjustments that fighters sometimes used to obscure themselves. It couldn't be confused by visual obstruction. It tracked on multiple spectra simultaneously, thermal, electromagnetic, pressure differential. You couldn't hide from it. Morrow knew this because Thessaly had told him, the night they'd talked in his cell, based on the maintenance contractor's specifications she hadn't gotten yet, but suspected she would. She'd been right. He'd thought about it for 2 hours after she left and figured something out. The drone couldn't be hidden from, but it could be given too much to track. The Kethkar was still partially in the drainage hole, struggling. The 2 Dravathi were incapacitated but not dead. They were generating heat signatures, electromagnetic fields, the biological pressure differentials that living things generate. The arena floor had 17 heat and pressure anomalies from the fight so far, including the drainage gap and the platform's hydraulic systems. When the drone entered, it had 6 strong tracking signals and 17 ambient signals, and the targeting system was sophisticated but not infinitely sophisticated. And Morrow positioned himself within 18 inches of the largest ambient heat source in the arena, the hydraulic rig for the east platform, which ran hot and stood very, very still. The drone circled for 47 seconds. 47 seconds of absolute stillness, with the crowd gone so quiet that people reported afterward hearing each other breathe. The drone's targeting cycled between signals, trying to build a clean lock, and kept getting interference from the hydraulic system's output. And on the 3rd cycle, Morrow moved, not away, toward, and got inside the drone's minimum targeting radius in 2 strides, which the targeting system was not designed to handle, and he put his blade into the drone's central processing housing and held it there until the lights went out. The drone fell. Morrow straightened up slowly. He rolled his shoulder, the left side, the one with the old scars. He looked at the blade in his hand for a moment, then he looked up. Not at the crowd, at the hospitality suite. At her. She raised her coffee-equivalent drink toward him. The crowd came apart. Part 6 after the sand. The immediate aftermath was complicated, as you'd expect. Orath Dren was detained by tribunal officers within 20 minutes of the fight's conclusion, before he could reach the transit corridors. The documentation Thessaly had filed the previous day had been comprehensive enough that the preliminary detention order had been standing by for 6 hours, waiting only for confirmation that the event had proceeded, which was the final piece of evidence needed to establish that the commission had gone through to completion, making Dren liable for the full charge set rather than just conspiracy. 3 senior consortium executives were served with inquiry notices before the crowd had even fully cleared the arena. The chemically stimulated Kethkar was taken to the arena medical facility, where the stimulant compound in its system created a secondary crisis. The treatment required was expensive, and the consortium, now in legal freeze, couldn't immediately authorize the payment. Thessaly's retinue settled the bill. She didn't announce this. The warden mentioned it later in his testimony as an aside. The 2 Dravathi survived. Both would require significant medical attention, and one would carry permanent joint damage. This weighed on Morrow, the warden told me later. He'd asked about them specifically, multiple times, while the medical team was treating his own injuries, which were a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a deep laceration on his right forearm that he hadn't mentioned during the fight and hadn't appeared to notice, or if he'd noticed, had filed it away under deal with this later. He dealt with it later. Thessaly came to the medical bay while the surgical unit was sealing the arm laceration. She came alone, no attendants. She sat down in the chair next to the treatment table and watched the medical technician work. From the recorded account of Prue Ovis, medical technician, Vorak Station, Arena Medical Bay. I've treated a lot of fighters in this facility, hundreds. You develop a kind of professional distance from it. You see so much injury that you stop really seeing the people and start just seeing the work. The human was different, partly because fighters who have just been through what he'd been through usually have a kind of relief. Some of them cry, some of them shake, some of them go completely flat and silent. He was processing something, I could tell that, but he was processing it very quietly. He kept asking about the Dravathi. The Vorathan came in about halfway through the laceration repair. She sat down and she just sat with him, not talking immediately, just present. After a few minutes he said, "You knew the drone specs 2 nights before you had them." She said, "I knew the contractor would be willing to share them. I'd spoken with his sister the day before. She had concerns about working conditions. I'd offered to include a labor practices note in the tribunal filing." He thought about that, then he said, "You set up a lot of pieces." She said, "I set up the pieces that were mine to set up." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The drainage floor, that wasn't in anything you told me." She said, "No, I didn't know about that." He smiled, not big, just a small one. He said, "I've been thinking about the drainage for 3 weeks." She said, "I noticed." I finished the repair and they kept talking. I stayed in the room because I had documentation to complete, but I don't think either of them was aware of me after that. I've been a medical technician for 11 years. I have never, in 11 years, felt like I was watching something I shouldn't be watching just because 2 people were talking. But that's what it felt like. Like I was in the room for the beginning of something, and the beginning of something is private. Part 7, What Came After and Why It Matters. The tribunal proceedings took 14 months. Orath Dren was convicted of commissioning a fraudulent lethal event and sentenced to 12 years in tribunal custody, plus the full restitution of his financial gains from related activities. 3 consortium executives received lesser convictions for facilitation. The Vorakin Merchant Consortium itself was placed under a tribunal administrative audit that effectively crippled its ability to run events for 2 years and resulted in the complete shutdown of the scenic scheduling program. The arena kept running, technically, under new management under tribunal oversight. Some fighters chose to stay, some left when they were offered freedom. The legal situation around fighter contracts was itself a major part of the tribunal proceedings. It turned out that most of the human fighters, and fighters from several other species, had been operating under contract terms that violated Galactic Commerce Treaty labor provisions, and the invalidation of those contracts was a whole separate layer of the legal action. Dax Morrow was released from his contract 63 days after the arena fight. He was the first one processed, which the tribunal attributed to the straightforwardness of his case, though Selixer of House Muron, who had become somewhat invested in following the proceedings, suggested to me privately that Thessaly's legal team had specifically prioritized the human's case file in the early documentation, which gave it an advantaged position in the processing queue. He spent 2 weeks on the station after his release. I don't have details on how he spent most of that time, but I know he visited the arena medical bay twice to check on the Dravathi fighters, both of whom were still in recovery. I know he had several long conversations with the arena warden, who was cooperating with the tribunal and was not himself charged with any offense. And I know he spent a significant amount of time in the station's main library archive, which is not a place most former arena fighters spent their post-release time. Thessaly von Morik remained on Vorak Station for the 63 days of the proceedings. Her diplomatic observation tour had been technically extended by the tribunal's request for her to remain available as a primary witness. The Vorathan Imperium, for their part, sent no formal communication objecting to this extension. The advisors who had arranged the tour, and who had arranged the reduction of her security retinue, were by this point themselves under internal Imperium review for unspecified reasons. Whether her father had anything to do with that review, or whether it was an independent outcome, was never made public. She gave her testimony to the tribunal in full. It was 47 pages in Galactic Standard and 3 separate hearing sessions, and was described by the presiding tribunal judge as the most thorough and precisely documented voluntary witness testimony this body has received in the past 2 decades. When the proceedings were formally advanced to the second stage, which no longer required her physical presence, she was free to leave. She didn't leave immediately. I asked the warden about this once, and he said she'd gone back to the observation rail on the practice sand one afternoon during the week before her departure. He'd been doing rounds and seen her there. The practice sand was empty, no fighters using it yet, program was still under suspension pending the audit. She just stood there, looking at the empty sand. He'd almost walked past, not wanting to intrude, but then she'd said without turning around, "Do you know where he went?" The warden said he didn't. Morrow had collected his things, not much. The cell hadn't allowed for much, and given the warden a handshake and a nod and walked toward the transit terminals. She'd been quiet for a moment, then she'd said, "He asked me something before he left. He asked me why. Why I'd done any of it. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. There were 100 safer ways for me to handle what I'd discovered." The warden said he hadn't answered, hadn't felt it was his place. She'd said, "I told him I'd watched him stand on that sand with a blade in his hand and look at the arena like it was a problem he'd already solved. I told him I'd never seen anyone look at something impossible that way before. I told him that watching someone refuse to accept that the outcome is already decided. I told him that was the thing I'd needed to see." She'd paused. He said it wasn't decided, that's the whole point. Then she turned from the rail and walked back through the corridor. She left the station 3 days later. Her transport logs show a filed course toward the Vorathan core, not the outer tour circuit she'd been assigned, but home directly. Whether that arrival was welcome or not, the historical record doesn't say. But the Vorathan Imperium applied for Galactic Tribunal membership 7 months later. First application in a century. The application cited, in its opening section, a renewed understanding of the value of galactic institutional frameworks in protecting individual dignity across species lines. The presiding judge who received the application noted, in a margin comment that was later included in the archived record, that the phrasing of that opening section bore a striking resemblance to the language of Thessaly von Morick's witness testimony. She'd told them what she'd seen. In her own words, in her own way. An arena that thought it had designed an outcome that couldn't be changed. And a man who'd looked at it like a problem he'd already solved. Recovered final page of Dax Morrow's cell block journal, found folded inside the maintenance manual for the arena's hydraulic systems, which he had borrowed from the warden 3 weeks prior and left behind when he departed. "I have been thinking about what it means to refuse. Not to fight, I know what fighting is, I've done enough of it. Not to resist, resistance implies you're pushing against something. I mean refuse in the older sense. To decline, to say this framing is wrong. This ending you've written is wrong, I'm not accepting it. There are things that look inevitable. The scenic schedules look inevitable. They've always worked before. The math looks right. The numbers say 4%. But the thing about the numbers is they assume you're accepting the situation they've defined. I wasn't accepting the situation. I was thinking about the drainage. That's the only lesson here if there is one. Not that humans are special. Not that we're stronger or smarter or luckier than other species. Just that we have this particular habit, this stubborn, sometimes stupid, occasionally very effective habit of looking at a situation someone else has decided is settled and saying, "I'm not sure that's right. Let me check the drainage." She understood that immediately. That was the thing about her. She watched for 2 hours from the observation rail, and she understood. The arena was designed to decide things. So was her tour and the removed security and the convenient accidents waiting to happen in the outer rim. Neither of us accepted the design. That's all, that's the whole story. The rest of it, the sand, the Dravathi, the drone, all of it, was just logistics. The decision was made before I ever walked through the gate. End of Story 1. Story 2. An alien princess chose a human prisoner as her guard. BY morning, 3 assassins had vanished. HFY sci-fi story narrated account, restricted documentation. Filed under Diplomatic Incident Archives, Human Behavioral Records, Velthari Station Event Log 9902R. The following account has been compiled from the testimony of Station Administrator Bren Voss, Security Chief Tarak of the Heldrani, Personal Attendant Yamara of House Thesavith, and the intelligence debrief of former prisoner Ezra Cole, conducted by Galactic Neutral Observer Commission representatives. All testimonies were given voluntarily following the conclusion of formal inquiries. Some portions are reconstructed from station security logs. This document is filed as part of the permanent diplomatic record of the Velthari Accords. Part 1. The night someone made a very strange request. The first thing you need to know about Velthari Station is that it runs on politics. Not exclusively. There's trade. There's transit. It sits at one of the busiest junction points in the mid-spiral arm where 3 major travel lanes cross, so there's always traffic. Cargo freighters, passenger ships, diplomatic transports, the occasional military vessel on public relations patrol. But all of that commerce exists inside a political structure so layered and old and complicated that most of the people working on the station couldn't tell you, in plain language, who actually ran it. Technically, the station was administered by a 5-member council representing the 5 species who'd founded it 400 years ago. Practically speaking, the council hadn't made an independent decision in 80 years. Practically speaking, Velthari Station was a diplomatic crossroads where different galactic powers jostled for influence through a combination of formal negotiations, economic pressure, strategic favors, and occasionally the kind of behind-the-scenes action that never made it into official records. It was, in other words, the kind of place where things happened that people were later very careful not to have documentation of. My name is Bren Voss, and I was the station administrator for 9 years before the events I'm going to describe. I'd been in station management for 20 years before that. I'd seen political maneuvering, I'd seen diplomatic crises, I'd seen 3 separate assassination attempts on visiting dignitaries during my tenure, none of which had been publicly acknowledged. I thought I'd seen most of what the station could produce. The night the Vorathan ambassador's daughter arrived changed my opinion on that. Her name was Myra von Sethal, second daughter of one of the Vorathan Imperium's senior ambassadorial families, traveling as part of a small diplomatic contingent for what was described in the pre-arrival documentation as a routine cultural exchange visit. She was 25 standard years old. She'd been assigned the station's mid-tier diplomatic quarters, comfortable but not extravagant, appropriate for her formal status, which was significant but not senior. She arrived at Velthari at 9th bell, station time, on a standard passenger transport from the Vorathan Corps. She had 4 attendants and no formal security detail. That last point was unusual for someone of her background, but not unheard of for a cultural exchange visit. Security details generated paperwork and political signals. Sometimes delegations traveled lighter on purpose. I greeted her in the docking bay, as protocol required for any diplomatic arrival at her rank level. The first thing I noticed was how she looked at the station, not the way tourists look wide-eyed, cataloging the interesting sights. Not the way diplomats usually look, calculating, noting exits and power positions. She looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient or a pilot looks at weather, like she was assessing something that was going to require a decision. I escorted her to the diplomatic quarters wing. She asked me, on the way, 3 questions. What was the current political temperature between the Heldrani delegation and the consortium trade representatives who were also on station? How long had the station's internal security rotation been running on its current schedule? And where was the prisoner holding facility relative to the diplomatic wing? I answered all 3, because she asked calmly and I was slightly off balance, and answering seemed like the right thing to do. Afterward, I stood in the corridor outside the diplomatic wing and thought about why a cultural exchange visitor had asked specifically where the prisoners were. I should have asked more follow-up questions. I didn't, and at 23rd bell that night, I received a communication that the Vorathan delegate had made a formal and entirely unprecedented request. She wanted a prisoner moved to her quarters to serve as her personal security detail for the duration of her stay. Not a station security officer, not a contracted protection specialist, a prisoner. One prisoner in particular. Let me tell you about Ezra Cole. He'd been at Velthari for 2 months. He'd arrived aboard a transport that was confiscated in a joint station Heldrani enforcement action against an unlicensed cargo operation. The cargo, industrial equipment components being routed without proper trade certification, was seized. The crew was processed, and most were released on fines. 2 of them, including Cole, were held pending investigation because their travel documentation was ambiguous and the investigation into the cargo operation was still open. Cole's documentation said he was a logistics contractor. His work history, when the investigators pulled it, showed 12 years of employment contracts across 6-star systems, mostly for mid-range freight and transit operations. Legitimate work, ordinary background. Nothing that explained the ambiguous documentation or the specific reason his release had been delayed when the others were let go. The security chief, Tarek of the Heldrani, told me later that Cole had been held partly because the cargo investigation was genuinely unresolved, and partly because his file had flagged a secondary review request from a third-party intelligence source. What that source was and why it had flagged him, Tarek didn't elaborate on, and I didn't press. Intelligence flags on prisoner files were above my administrative lane. Cole had been in holding for 2 months. He hadn't complained. He hadn't caused trouble. He'd been, by all accounts, extremely quiet. He ate his meals. He slept his hours. He spent most of his time either sitting in silence or using the facility's limited terminal access to read engineering and navigation documentation. The holding staff noted in their weekly reports that he seemed completely unbothered by the situation. Not depressed, not angry, just quiet like he was waiting for something, and whatever it was, he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. He was 32 standard years old. He was human. He was, by the physical assessment taken at intake, in good physical condition, not arena fighter physique, not military bulk, just the lean, functional build of someone who'd spent a long time doing physical work in environments that required it. He had a scar along his left jaw that the intake medical scan noted as an old injury, healed naturally rather than surgically, which meant it had healed in a context where surgical correction wasn't available. That detail stuck with me when I read his file later. Someone who'd been in a situation bad enough to leave a facial scar and hadn't had access to a medical facility to fix it afterward. But none of that was why Myra von Sethol had requested him specifically. I still don't know, fully, how she knew about him. My best working theory, developed over the following weeks, was that she'd reviewed the station's prisoner manifest the moment she got access to the diplomatic wing's data terminal, which happened automatically upon check-in, as a courtesy access for visiting delegates. And that in reviewing the manifest, she'd noticed something about his file that triggered whatever thought process led to her request. What specifically she noticed, or how she connected it to whatever she knew that none of the rest of us did, I can't say for certain. She knew something, that much became clear very quickly. From the recorded testimony of Ymara of House Thesivith, personal attendant to Myra von Sethol, filed with the Galactic Neutral Observer Commission. I have been Delegate Myra's attendant for 4 years. In that time, I have watched her do many things that surprised people. She has a way of understanding situations that other people take much longer to understand. It's not that she's faster at thinking. It's that she's been thinking before other people realize there's something to think about. When we arrived at Velthari, she was already thinking. I noticed it in the docking bay while the administrator was greeting us. She was listening to him, she was responding appropriately, she was present in the conversation, but part of her was elsewhere. I know her expressions well enough to see when she's in 2 places at once. That night when the others went to rest, she asked me to stay up with her. She had the data terminal active and she was reading. For a long time she was reading station files, publicly accessible records, manifest lists. I made tea and didn't interrupt. At some point she said, without looking up, "There's a human in holding. Name is Cole. His file has a third-party intelligence flag that the station's security chief can see but hasn't actioned on." I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "The timestamp on the secondary review request is 7 weeks old. The standard actioning window for that type of flag is 3 weeks. If it had been actioned, his status would have changed. There's a notation protocol. His status hasn't changed, which means either the flag was reviewed and deprioritized, or the person who received it chose not to action it. Given the source designation on the flag, the second option is more likely." I said, "What's the source designation?" She looked at me over the terminal. She said, "The consortium." I understood then why she'd asked me to stay up. She made the formal request for him to be transferred to our quarters shortly after. I helped her draft the language so it fell within the diplomatic accommodation provisions in the station charter. There's a clause that allows visiting delegates to designate personal security arrangements independently of station security systems, which had been put in there 80 years ago for a reason I suspect no one on the current council fully remembered. When I asked her how she knew the consortium intelligence flag meant what she thought it meant, she said, "I don't know for certain, but if I'm wrong, we've given a logistics contractor a more comfortable room for the night, and the worst outcome is some paperwork." She paused. "And if I'm right," she said, "we'll know by morning."